and Eric Ball, thank you so much for joining the 25th hour. We really thank you for taking your time out of your day to join us here and talk a little bit about what you do, what you hope to accomplish. Paolo, you are the executive director of the Outrun Coalition, and Eric Ball, you are also a board member and the village trustee of Delaware County in New York State. Do I have that right, gentlemen?
That's correct. Yep.
Okay, so Paolo, what is the Outrun Coalition? What do you hope to achieve?
So the Outrun Coalition was a group started after kind of like on the basis of Democratic reaction within rural communities of Democratic candidates to the murder of George Floyd.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, I had been a state party officer in the state Democratic Party, New York State Young Democrats Rural Caucus chair. And I just got really bothered by the fact that some Democratic candidates, first-time candidates who had never run before, who were mostly white, by the way, ran in this idea that they couldn't condemn the murder of George Floyd, that they couldn't talk about Black Lives Matter in small communities because somehow people of color don't exist in these counties, or that LGBTQ plus folks don't exist in these counties, or young people don't exist in these counties. So I quit the party. And I was like, things are not going well. 2020, yeah, we won. But across upstate New York, those same people who were unwilling to condemn the murder of George Floyd, regardless, got destroyed down ballot for Congress and stuff. I mean, I could tell you about a congressional candidate who at one point was like going up to Black Lives Matter rallies and saying Black Lives Matter needs to be unnecessary, which seemed like a very problematic thing to say. She ended up losing 60-40 after raising $2 million. So we realized that, after 5 years in the rural caucus, we had elected over 85 people to local office. And the folks that won, one is running by themselves, and one in these rural communities, often ousting Republican incumbents, being openly LGBTQ, being Black, brown, Latino, what have you. And so we started the Outrun to show that can be done, and show rural communities that we can elect progressive voices to these elections and to all of these local elected positions, and that Republicans don't have to go unopposed, and that utilizing diversity to do candidate recruitment is the best way for the Democratic Party to win elections across rural America.
And Eric, as a board member, were you also part of the Outrun Coalition's attempt at putting a Democrat in Delaware County and in the village? Do you guys have a village board? You're a trustee. So first of all, what is it called that you're a part of? And was that also part of the Outrun Coalition?
Right. So what I'm a part of is our local village government, and it's comprised of, a mayor and 4 other council members. So I serve as one of those council members. I was elected my second term this March in 2021. And so, yeah, I've really been cooking along here. When I first met Paolo, he helped with phone banking for my first election. And, we got connected, and we've been, just sort of growing the relationship. How can we be effective in being that voice in rural communities and giving people support in elections like mine? So since being a board member, I've been involved in the various trainings across the country. Paolo, I'm not sure how many states we've done so far. I've lost track.
Six so far.
Which has been amazing, to speak to people all over the country. It's really been awesome. So,
and what would you guys say are, what was the secret sauce to having someone like Eric win in his position? Because Paolo, as you mentioned to me, that Delaware County has a majority Republican legislative body, or at least
majority.
Supermajority, the supermajority of Republicans there. What do you attribute that success to?
I think that one of the things, and I'll let Eric speak and I won't talk too long, but one of the things that people don't realize about rural communities is, like, if you grow up in them, they know you, regardless of whether you're LGBTQ plus, regardless if you're Hispanic or something. I grew up in Chemung County, which isn't that far from Eric. And people there know me, right? And if they know you, and they know that they can trust you, and they know that you've overcome adversity, then they trust you. You're not some big New York City liberal elite that's coming in. And that's what worked with Eric. Eric ousted, correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, you ousted a 17-year incumbent?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
And out of nowhere.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
You didn't expect to win, Eric?
No, to put it pretty bluntly, but I wanted to run and see what I could achieve there. And I recall election night when they were announcing results, and I was more shocked than anything.
And how did it feel once you learned that you ended up becoming the victor in your race?
That was pretty cool. I mean, it was a great feeling. I called my uncle, who's an alderman in further upstate in Waterford, New York, and yeah, I was elated and humbled that people would vote for me, and and vote for me twice. So
there you go. Congratulations. And
Yeah.
gentlemen, we live in a very partisan time. And I think that many Democrats, they thought that once Trump was gone and Republicans were out of power. I mean, I wouldn't say that they're out of power completely, right? The way our congressional makeup is structured, it's Democrats don't have the power, even though they're the majority, quote unquote,
Yeah.
on the federal level. But even here in the state, for example, a lot needs to get done, and it's not getting done. And nevertheless, we saw a big power grab by Republicans here on the city level. On the state level, Republicans have made strides again. So what is your answer to that, especially for a group trying to instill more progressive candidates? I'm sure that you run into your run-of-the-mill Fox News watching, Tucker Carlson watching Republicans out there. What is your answer to the latest Republican tide from this last election?
So those folks exist, and that's a real thing. But in my opinion, the biggest block within rural organizing for Democratic candidates who are diverse candidates can oftentimes come from within the Democratic Party. And there is a problem within the Democratic Party about having conversations with diversity, specifically in rural communities. And so sometimes somebody will say, this person should run for for county legislature, not this person. And oftentimes the word that I always hear that's used against people who are younger or people of color or something who want to run for office in these rural communities is that they don't have experience. And experience can be a code word for anything along the lines of making sure that that person can't be shut out of the conversation. But then you got this, and mind you, by the way, Dennis, the average county committee member in all of New York State for the Democratic Party is like 60 years old. Right. And then they wonder why they can't get candidates to run. It's honestly because, yeah, we do have to deal with Republicans, but that's a different conversation. The biggest thing that we have to deal with is making even sure that candidates can actually run a productive campaign. As for the Republicans, there is this great thing that I think is a large level of inequality in that there are a lot of Democratic parties across the country that do not know what things like a win number are or how to use band targeting data and stuff. And once you equip a kid, like a 22-year-old or something, to do that, to door knock against like an 85-year-old incumbent, I mean, come on. We've seen folks who are actually doing the work of building the campaign, building a plan, oust incumbents in school board elections in places like, Aransas County, Texas was like the last election where we were at. It's a county that voted 75% for Trump. Our good friend Juanice Butler just won her school board election, first Black woman. And it's about working and making sure that we can speak to the community, because not everything has to be about Tucker Carlson or Fox News. Sometimes things are talking about standing up for our communities in a way that isn't caught up in the partisan divide. Because let's be honest, there are downstate establishments for both the Republicans and Democrats. And sometimes an upstate Democrat has to fight against the notion of just, being this like New York City liberal or something. Yeah. Does that make sense? I don't know.
Yeah. No, it definitely makes sense. And I think that a good question for Eric. I mean, you are, I believe, the first openly gay village trustee in Delaware County. How has it been navigating your neck of the woods, basically, and working with Republicans and even Democrats, within your constituency, within the actual body of government? How has it been? How's it been navigating? Have you been receiving pushback based on identity? Have you been receiving coded pushback? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, just right off the bat, on a personal level, running for office as an openly gay person, definitely wasn't high on the list. I don't really like to run on my personal life, or I'm a private person, and but no, as far as pushback, sure, there may be behind closed doors, there's some coded pushback, but I've been myself, and I've been genuine to to my goals and to the constituents. And I've been an open ear and I've been responsive. So that's how I push through any sort of evidence of, pushback or subversion for my identity,
Do you feel like that your identity has been on the back burner compared to the work that you're doing every day in Delaware County?
Well, it's always going to be on the back of my mind, but no, that's been my focus, just to deliver for the people that elected me to get in that office and bring results. So
my next question is this, Paolo and Eric. The Outrun Coalition, I see you guys have recruited 140 candidates in town councils, and even in positions such as sheriffs and constables and town supervisors. A lot of these are hyper local elections. And Paolo, my question to you is, what is the long-term view of the Outrun Coalition here? Are you planning to continue trying to go after these types of positions? And basically, what is the plan?
So the plan is to make sure that we can actually build an infrastructure across rural counties so that we don't have wipeouts like 20, right? I want a class of local elected officials. I'll give you an example. My good friend Ben Johnson, who's was a village trustee in Johnson City, Binghamton, right, in Anthony Brindisi's congressional district, right. He was a DSA endorsed village trustee, got elected at the age of 19, youngest elected official in New York State. My friend Delvin Moody, who just won re-election to Utica City Council, youngest African American elected official in New York State. These are folks who are being activated in these communities where these communities matter for the context of the national conversation. In that, if a person gets elected in a small town in upstate New York versus city council in New York City, I'm going to be honest with you, and a lot of New York City people don't like me for saying this, but that kid who's a 22-year-old that gets elected to village trustee in New Paltz or in Broome County or wherever, they have a larger chance of getting elected to Congress because they have more enthusiasm and more money to be able to kind of throw around in a race. Why? Because usually in those communities, the committees, they say they have to nominate this kind of like person that runs for Congress. It has to be, this cookie cutter conservative Democrat, gun owning and stuff. And that's the thing. But also, upstate is not just this conservative idea, and upstate Democrats are not just the idea of conservative Democrat gun toting and stuff. There are folks of color who get elected to county legislatures. There is a congressman of color representing the Hudson River Valley. The first LGBTQ plus congressman in New York State's history comes from the Hudson River Valley. There are multiple of women of color elected to office across the state. And we need to celebrate that. And we need to celebrate that because we need to be a shining example for rural communities across this country, that we do not have to accept this idea that our communities have to accept some conservative or progressive moderate versus moderate conversation. Because at the we're going to lose without proper representation. The long-term is making sure that we can keep on continue to contesting these local offices, obviously win some. We're not going to win every one, but it's making sure that we can get proper representation and show the National Democratic Party that diversity is a thing that matters across rural communities.
Eric, as someone who comes from, both in a position that you just recently got reelected, and, as a board member of Outrun, what would you say to somebody hoping to run in their local election, one that doesn't get any mainstream views, for example? What did you think was the most surprising fact, or what do you wish is something that you knew beforehand, before you ran, that you can impart as part of your wisdom to somebody hoping to run for their school board election or their next village board election, for example? What would you say to them?
Well, I'd say 100%. If you're looking to run for office, just do it and believe in yourself and reach out to organizations like Outrun to get that support, to push you across that line of decision making, because that's what got me to make the final decision, was someone encouraged me to run for office. And these conversations that we've had in other states, that is one of the goals, is to encourage people that, your voice matters, you deserve a seat at the table, and, do it. But yeah.
What kind of difference do you feel like you're making now that you're in a position that you're hoping to win for?
So, yeah, well, I'm involved in a lot of decisions and taking the lead on a lot of important issues, involved in police reform, involved in the cannabis decision that's going throughout the state right now. That was one of the most important recent things that I've been doing. So I'm at the forefront of decisions that affect our economy and the betterment of my community. So yeah.
I really respect that, because I think that there's too many people out there that say that they're always concerned about what's going on and feel like the challenge of running for office is incredibly daunting. As someone from New York City, and Paolo, you know how this feels. I mean, personally, because I know that you've been around here, it could be very intimidating, considering the party bosses, considering the political clubs, the money that gets thrown around. It could be incredibly difficult and intimidating for someone who wants to run for office the first time. They feel like they're not going to be able to make the kinds of ripple effects that Eric, that you're able to in your position. And so, Paolo, my question to you is, what do you say to those in city elections and city politics that you want them to know about rural political outreach? Do you think that they have it wrong in their heads, or their stereotypes that they're running off of? What do you want them to know about what you do?
I guess one of the biggest things that I saw, and to kind of just tie it to what happened recently with Kyle Rittenhouse, and this is something that's interesting about racism, right, and white supremacy, is that, Kyle Rittenhouse got off, and that's horrible, and it's so wrong what happened. But I've seen a really big trend within, New York City political circles and stuff, wanting to make this conversation about gun control. And that's great, and that's a part of the conversation. But when you see a bunch of white people talking about gun control in the context of somebody who showed up at a Black Lives Matter rally to murder people who were standing up for racial justice, it's pretty clear that the issue is white supremacy. And we need to be able to address the issue of white supremacy. And so when it comes to talking about rural communities and rural voters, it's not so much as the idea of we need to be able to kind of just figure out who they are. We exist in these areas. We exist in these communities. We are already here. People in places of power and positions of power within the Democratic Party need to listen to us, because we are the people who have been able to kind of get these elections done. And in 2018, the largest strength of the Democratic Party was from rural communities. It wasn't from the suburbs, wasn't from the city. It was from rural communities. And so we just need to make sure that we are listened to and that we're empowered, and that we are creating this notion where we don't erase people of color from rural communities. Because oftentimes when you go to some of these Democratic clubs in Manhattan and stuff, they're just like, oh, they're all white, they're all conservative out there. It's often not the case. And what that leads to is a situation where rural communities and rural county Democratic parties are often discouraged from running from people for office, or they're so dysfunctional that they can't find people to run for office because they just don't have the ability to recruit people. And often that leads to is people in positions of power, Republicans, far-right Republicans in positions of power in places where Democrats have won at every other level of the ticket. And that happens a lot in upstate New York. And there are towns that Joe Biden has won and have no Democratic representation at the local level. And it's because they've just never tried.
So is it your position, guys, that, this most recent election, these most recent election results, are they really a product of Democrats not turning out, their own and the numbers that are needed to keep winning elections? Or is it because of Republicans maybe having a winning message, whether or not those messages are based in fact or not?
Yeah.
But, what is your position about how Democrats ended up, losing in a lot of places?
Well, I think that there's two things. Well, I don't know, Varick, if you want to go.
Go for it.
Okay. I think that there's two things that happen that are pretty kind of realistic, is that the Republicans had a well-coordinated message, but also the Democrats in many places, when they ran campaigns, a lot of these county Democratic parties that were running local elections, and we can talk about other counties. I won't name the county's name, but there was a county that was until like 6 months ago doing polling on whether or not Governor Cuomo should stay in office. Well, they had a full slate for town council candidates, and they would rather spend their time doing that than helping their local candidates. My home county of Chemung, the local the city court judge in a city that Joe Biden won, didn't launch his campaign until this September, announced it 8 months ago and did not launch it. And so for us, it's not just turnout, it's also technical assistance for Democratic candidates and being able to find the right kind of people to run for office. Being able to find the right kind of people to run for office is not finding some lawyer who says he's going to run for county legislature, because that person might not listen to someone like me. Sometimes, let's be honest, I faced racial issues within the party. I faced people telling me like, Paolo, you're brown. What would you know about rural organizing? And these are the same people who can't figure out what their win number is, or can't tell me, what their campaign outreach strategy is. And it's a lot more about like finding the people who should run for office instead of trying to figure out a way to work with the people who are already running, because sometimes the people who are already running, I mean, some of these campaigns were just really, really bad, and really, really did not have the technical support or assistance that they could have. And really, it goes down to, we really need to make sure that we reform some of these county Democratic parties so there is not as much of a top-down approach in candidate recruitment, because we end up not having candidates when people are telling young people or LGBTQ plus people, when older white people are telling young people, LGBTQ plus people, Black and brown folks, that they can't run for office based on experience for a town council seat. Like, what is the experience for that, right? So I think that's our big thing. It's not just turnout, it's technical infrastructure building. And also, we are here to ensure that people know that we do exist in rural communities, and that immigrants can run for office in rural communities, and LGBTQ plus folks can run and win in rural communities. And we can win in places that Trump won, and we can win as Democrats, and we can be progressive. And that's the biggest thing that we need to do.
Yeah, Paolo. Yeah, Paolo, and just to touch on one of the things you mentioned, I think particularly in my county, the party was a bit timid on issues, taking a position on certain subjects, like cannabis, like the piece of legislation that was just recently passed. Things that really affect people, that can really bring benefits to regular people, the common man, woman. I mean, that timid stature on taking a position. I think that was my personal experience in this county, and people need to be bold, and people are looking for leadership, especially on these issues that affect common people. So
I think the common thread from what I'm hearing from both of your answers is that the Democratic Party needs to be more aggressive. Is that right?
Aggressive in a way that, like, and listen, I've been called, Dennis, you've been in the classroom with me. I've been called aggressive a lot. Right. Being aggressive that can challenge the stereotypes of rural communities from a standpoint of diversity. And it has to be aggressive enough to say that, like, people are saying, like, how are we going to win these places back? Oh my God, we lost yada, yada, thousands plus less state legislative seats. Okay, if we can give $72 million to the Lincoln Project, we can give Eric Ball $1,000 to run for village trustee, and he'll be the emperor of his village at some point. But here's the more important part. Like I brought up earlier, in Eric being elected village trustee, and this is the thing that people don't realize, being elected in village board or local board of these towns, the state Senate Democrats start looking at you, and they start looking for as a candidate because, you've been able to get elected there. And that's what we want. We want to be able to run people. We're tired of, like, people moving into our districts and being like, oh, I'm going to run for this, I'm going to run for that. And it just doesn't work, man. And for me, like, there are good people in the community. There are people who may not look like the district, but can represent the district better than someone who says that they are from the district and are not,
I get what you're saying. And Eric, this question is a little bit directed at you, but Paolo, feel free to join in as well. Do you feel like you are riding this tension between trying to be a progressive stalwart or reformer, but at the same time playing the game of politics and having to cater to the establishment in some way? Do you feel like you've had to do any of that?
Not had to sacrifice what I believed in, and that's first and foremost. Where compromises come is where compromise should be in this country. We often don't find compromise these days. You're either at one pole or the other. I've worked with people that I disagree with. I still work with people that I disagree with, but I work with people, and for the cannabis situation, our mayor, former New York City narcotics officer, he and I agree that cannabis is not a gateway drug, how we've treated cannabis the past however many years, target minorities, disproportionately put in prison. There's things that we can agree upon. This is just common sense. And in my opinion, but yeah, it is, I can see that it could be daunting or really questionable. How can you function? How can you be effective in a minority status on a board or anything? But I really have just brought my things and let it see where it falls, But
And Paolo, the reason why I even asked this is because you mentioned that, people like Eric could be starting to be watched by leadership, and that could bring future opportunities in the future. Who knows? But, what if these leaders are the ones that we're trying to replace in the first place, right? Because they're too old, their viewpoints are really antiquated. How do you compromise that sort of tension?
Well, listen, I'm no stranger to kind of having to go toe to toe with the Democratic Campaign Committee and other larger, right? They wasted a long time trying to flip seats in Long Island, only to win the supermajority because of upstate New York, right? In districts that Hillary and Biden and Obama won by 60%, right? So instead of talking about going toe to toe with these folks, I'm more interested in elevating the voices from our communities. And those voices that we elevate, those voices are worth more than any sort of thing that whatever establishment can bring, right? At one point, the work that we were doing, we were accused of, a long time ago, we were accused of creating more stuff for teaching because we were organizing in rural communities and electing folks who could get elected in these places, who could kind of propagate the work to get elected in these places and do better than the rest of the Democratic Party. And that's worth millions. Right. And so for me, it's not as much of I have to stand up to the establishment or something. I'm tired of being told that people like me do not exist in my community by both Democratic and Republican Party. And I'm here to stand up for my rural community as a person of color, as a first generation immigrant. And if you don't like it, then you need to get over your stereotypes because we're going to keep on fighting. And there are thousands of people in New York City who, if you want to talk about funding and stuff like that, they moved to New York City. They're from West Virginia. They're from upstate New York. They're from Wisconsin or something. And they're never targeted to give money to these donation to these elections. But we can make sure that they feel empowered and they feel that they're standing up for their hometowns. No one should have to say that they should be ashamed of where they're from. That makes sense.
No, that totally makes sense, and nobody should feel ashamed from where they're from. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And yeah, guys, in our last few minutes together, we could talk all day about how we can, transform the world, right? But how is your outlook looking into the next year? Because we are just hearing a blitz of mainstream pieces saying that Democrats are going to lose control of the federal government. They'll point at Biden's low poll numbers. They'll point at the historic trend of the president losing control of the legislature. I don't know how this is going to trickle down statewide, right? So I want to hear if you guys are preparing yourselves or in general kind of what your attitude is looking at the midterms for next year and how you're preparing for it.
Yeah. Eric,
Sure.
Eric, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we can't ignore the fact that the history of our republic, things go in cycles, right? I mean, we have to recognize that. That doesn't mean we don't fight like hell regardless. But, the enthusiasm in elections often wanes in these types of, midterm elections. But the fight remains the same, and we got to fight for what we believe in. And if we lose, we're still going to be there. We're still going to matter, and we're still going to try to, raise hell. So,
yeah, I guess on my end, I'll bring up a little before we go. Is I got attacked by a white supremacist on Twitter the other day, and it was interesting because I mentioned that the last time that Republicans lost Congress was when Charlottesville happened. And this person was like, why would you think Charlottesville was such a problem? That was a problem with zoning. And I was like, this is white supremacy creeping back into the Republican Party, right? And what Democrats need to do now is we need to activate our conversations about what's happening in terms of economic justice, in terms of standing up for white supremacy, and in terms of things like, standing up for dairy farmers and stuff, things that the Democratic Party used to do really well. And we need to do it in a way that makes sure that we can show people that that's not a viable path forward. Like, how many more, I guess I'll put it to you this way, like, I don't think most voters in this country want to show that they are going to have to go into a grocery store armed because there's a guy out there concealed carrying to protect property from Antifa. I don't think that makes any voter safe. I don't think that makes any voter happy. And by the way, we don't need to win a majority of rural Democratic or rural voters. We need to win enough of them to be able to win a congressional election. Mm-hmm. And people think it's a daunting task, and it can be, but it's not as bad as people think. Mm-hmm. And the biggest conversation is making sure that, we find capable candidates that are willing to take on the message, and that we don't falter on things. And that when we do find people to run for Congress, that it's not some attorney that's willing to run for Congress that moved there from Manhattan or something. That it's like a person from the community, and that it is somebody that is actually interested in making sure that we talk about the things that matter. Money is a thing that exists in Democratic politics. If the Lincoln Project can get $72 million, I don't see any problem for any Democratic candidate running across a competitive district to not get that money as well. So for me, for 2022, I'm ensuring myself that we actually have to have this conversation about white supremacy. Mm-hmm. And that now is the time to activate that conversation, unless we, people can talk about gun control all they want. That's fine. That's part of the conversation. But unless we have a concerted effort to confront white supremacy from all factions within the Democratic Party, we're not going to be able to move forward, and we're not going to be able to keep our majority. But you know what? I will say this: Republicans, and even at the grassroots level, Republican County Committee Chair, kind of like spar with me about Kyle Rittenhouse. They don't want to defend that whole situation. It makes people uncomfortable. It makes people really uncomfortable that happened. Mm-hmm. And that gives me hope, because now they're stuck with that conversation of having to defend that. And there was an article that came out a few days ago about how more Kyle Rittenhouses are going to be a thing. Yeah, it's going to happen. Mm-hmm. It's going to happen. Look, if we're already like getting attacked on social media about white supremacists, like, this is Charlottesville 2.0, and we need to confront that.
There's a lot of shakiness about continuously talking about race in Democratic circles and Democratic ads, trying to get voters to come to the polls and support Democratic officials. And now we're also starting to hear about how economics is becoming more of a rallying cry for Republicans. And this would be my last question to you, both of you. Is the Outrun Coalition also delving into that conversation about economics? We're hearing about inflation, whether that's a red herring or not is, it's a whole nother thing. And maybe that's one thing you guys touch on, but how are you guys trying to tackle the economics issues? And Eric, you can also talk a little bit about how maybe in the rural community, the rural side of things compared to the city, this might affect people more or less. Talk about how you're trying to deliver that message.
Yeah, well, it certainly is difficult, and I remember when gas was almost $5 a gallon. Don't recall the year, but but it really hits rural America the hardest, and really hard. I don't want to discount anyone's struggles, but that really does affect people's perceptions and what they have access to or what they don't have access to. It's difficult to explain how policies made 2 or 3 years ago somehow don't affect or take effect until 2 or 3 years later. That's a hard conversation to have with people when they are just looking to fill their gas tank, or maybe they only have $10 to put in their gas tank. Those are big messaging issues, and that the Democratic Party needs to figure out how to handle, because people are desperate for answers and desperate for relief in these types of inflections in the economy. economy. So it's a message that I'm working on and trying to understand. But first of all, listening to people that I represent and how I can elevate their voices to my state senators and my congressional representative.
And what are you telling the constituents that are worried that Democrats are not the leaders anymore to take charge of the economic issues? I mean, I guess in your area where you represent.
Well, I have a history background, and sometimes maybe that doesn't win with people, but my grandfather was a dairy farmer and a Democrat. Mm-hmm. And most dairy farmers in my area were Democrats post-Depression. I think the Democrats have had better solutions in times of economic strife. I think we're seeing some good legislation that will assist regular people, as opposed to giving benefits to corporations, mega corporations with the tax breaks. So, I mean, it's a difficult conversation to have, especially when things are just so fundamentally basic about affording groceries. You don't want to get too in the weeds with people, but it's something that I constantly am thinking about. And, Paolo and the rest of Outrun, we're all always bouncing ideas off each other. How can we improve? How can we be more receptive and just keep our ear to the floor?
And Paolo, what's your closing message on the economic side of things from Outrun?
Dennis, Outrun was founded on the basis that rural Democrats always have to outrun the top of the ticket. So we always have to run ahead of Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, or whoever's at the top of the ticket. Finally, in terms of economics, one of the biggest things that I would love to talk about is that our President Donald Trump literally said, "How can people live in upstate New York? It's so bad." And yeah, some people could agree with him. It's bad, but these are communities where people stayed, and these are communities that matter. And at the end of the day, we need to find a message that makes sense for these communities. And it isn't just about, this tax credit's going to bring these jobs here and it's going to keep people here. It's more along the lines of let's be patriotic. Let's start making things in America again. You don't want to have supply chain issues? Let's make semiconductors in America. Let's make them in Elmira, New York. Let's make things in America again. And let's make sure we stand up for farmers and that we stand up for fair trade. Because at the end of the day, these are not issues that affect, a lot of people in places like New York City. I get that. But just like Black Lives Matter affects rural working class people and places and people in places in Brooklyn, so does trade. Mm-hmm. The fact that these towns are being devastated by the lack of economic development is something that we need to address head on. And addressing that head on is making sure that we force this conversation in the Democratic Party. It's not, Eric said we can talk about explaining policies and stuff. We need to take up space in the party. And that's what Outrun does. Outrun develops leaders to take up the space within the Democratic Party to talk about the economics of rural America and what we need to do. We talk about the dairy industry here in New York State or anywhere in the country or any of the states that we've been in. People are like, the dairy industry is dying. And I think reckon to the fact that there was a state senator who was like, the dairy industry needs to die in New York. And I was just like, how is that progressive? Right. And you look at Canada, and Canada has a thriving micro dairy industry based on sustainable tax credits and micro credits and a sustainable economic model for these farmers. And I just wonder, why does the Canadian government, why does the Canadian Labour Party, why are they, or the Liberals, why are they better of farming communities than we are? Why are they able to create a sustainable base in those areas? And the truth is priority. And yeah, we can stand up for trans lives. We can stand up for Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter exists in rural communities. Trans folks exist in rural communities. They have economic issues as well. And we have to be able to talk to these folks, and we have to be able to empower them, because that's a winning message.
Thank you so much, Paolo Cremidis, Executive Director of Outrun, and Eric Ball, Village Trustee and Board Member of Outrun, Village Trustee of Delaware County. Thank you guys so much for coming on the show and explaining to the audience who you are and what you're trying to achieve. I wish you guys the best of luck.